Thanks, Simon. Simon was the founder of NPI and has been an amazing kind of intellectual force in helping push through the thinking that we've been doing for the last almost now 2 years. Now, this is a topic that I am absolutely enthralled with, actually. I think this millennial story is, by the way, this is Rui Teixeira here. Hang on one second. Why don't you just, actually, why don't you sit right here for a minute?
Oh, okay.
We're not quite at the Rui point here yet. Rui and I are going to be doing the presentation here very shortly on the data here. But let me just frame a little bit what's going on with this report. We have got, this millennial generation is a massive generation. These are roughly thinking about it as young people born in the 80s and 90s. And they are making a big and huge impact on the economy, on society, on our culture. And now they're starting to do it about our politics. So people have been thinking about these millennial generation, and they're thinking about, now they're starting to think about it on politics. And generically, we've been thinking about it, what's going to be their impact on politics? Well, it's turning out that actually their impact on politics is quite profound. And we're going to lay out here to you some of the findings of this is, you know, they're actually much more politically engaged than other previous young people. They're actually voting in much higher numbers for Democrats, which we're going to start laying out here. And they also are holding values. When you really drill down in the values of what these folks have, they're very progressive values. And so these large numbers of young people moving into the population and moving into the voting constituencies now, holding these kind of values is going to make an enormous impact on politics. Now, people have been getting little snippets of this here and there. All kinds of different reports have been coming out that have been starting to show this, exit polls and different public opinion surveys and things like that. And what we decided to do at the New Politics Institute is instead of taking another sliver of this and looking down in some kind of narrow area of what they believe, we said, let's do this. Let's start to connect the dots between all these different reports that are coming out and survey the whole landscape of these surveys and reports that's already out there and start to bring it together in a way that you have a kind of analytical framework and a kind of more rigor to it that actually lays out what really seems to be happening today. And to do that, we turn to Rui Teixeira. So Rui, this is where I was going to turn to you here. Rui is one of the fellows at the New Politics Institute, and Rui is a guy who absolutely loves numbers. I mean, Rui and numbers, you know, lock him in a room with a database and he'd be totally happy for weeks at a time. And so what we said is, Rui, go out there, look at all available data that really makes sense in this, go deep into all these exit polls, go to all these different data sources, and start to tease out really what seems to make the most sense. So this is what we did, is we came up with this new report that we're now titling The Progressive Politics of the Millennial Generation, with the two of us here actually driving it. And so what we're going to do lay out to you today is the findings of this, which again is going to be available for you off when you leave here. You can all get the hard copy there. It's on our website that you'll be able to pass it around. But we're going to lay it out here in a kind of PowerPoint slide presentation here that hopefully gives you a good takeaway. Now, after we do this, we have two panelists here too that we're going to basically talk to, and I'll introduce them when the time comes. But we're going to actually talk about how do you actually reach these folks increasingly. There's new ways to actually connect with them, and ultimately we're going to have a millennial, a millennial right out of central casting is the way I think of it, who's going to talk a little bit about his generation. So to start, and then by the end, hopefully we're going to have a little bit of a dialogue here, and as you can see, you all have these UN-style microphones. All you got to do is turn them on. We can actually have a real debate just like right out of the UN, so it'll be fun. Now to start out, you know, millennials. It's not self-evident who are these millennials, right? And the thing about generations is they don't really clarify the beginnings and endings, or for that matter, the name for a while when they're starting to merge. Young people just, they're kind of considered different things. So the millennial generation is starting to actually coalesce in the general kind of way of public analysis. It's starting to come together. And what we did for this, and so generally it's been people born in the 80s and 90s is the way people have been talking about it. Now what we did for this report is you have to start looking hard at where do you start to find the beginning of them. What we started to look at is we said 1978 is when the birth rate started to rise out of what Generation X had been. And so basically what it was essentially was the baby boomers who got to the point where they started to have kids. So we start to see this inflection point in the birth rate, fertility rate. So that's a good place to start. The place where it ends is all under debate. And some people who even call this the millennial generation take it all the way to 2000 in terms of the last births. We say 1996 in this case because it's an 18-year span, which is roughly common in generational terms. And also it's exactly the span that the baby boom was. So it makes it easier to compare between generations. But in some respects, 96 is a little bit arbitrary. Now, this again, other people have termed this different things. It was originally called the Echo Boom because of the baby boomers, and then Gen Y just because it was a holding place after Gen X. But over time, essentially, it's starting to come out as millennials, and that's because it actually has more of the spirit of what these young people are about, and a little more of the sense of their personality, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, this is another quick way to kind of understand it. This is an age pyramid here to understand the size of it, particularly of this millennial generation. We've used this before. Now, this is essentially the American population age pyramid, as they call it, going to 2015. And as you can see here, the boomers, 74 million strong, are kind of going to the point where they're going to break the bank here on Social Security and others that are worrying folks. But this is the millennials behind this is actually a bigger generation. For a long time, we were saying they're exactly the same, but because of infill immigration and because of people dying off here, actually it's turning out that as you put this out, they're actually a bigger generation than the boomers now, and they are just moving into their what they'll be essentially in basically two presidential cycles, just 2 cycles down here. They'll all be in the electorate, and they'll be basically in their 20s and 30s, which is a very potent time for any kind of generation. It's where they form all their politics and really make a huge impact on society. Now, think just one more thing about the numbers. And in politics, you really just got to take a minute here to think about the numbers. The numbers are immense. So right now, they are basically what you think of as 20-year-olds and folks in their teens. And that's 20-year-olds is a great, I mean, they are now all, so any of these polls now that say 29 and under, the youth vote, it's them now, as opposed to them and part of Generation X, which has been for the last decade here. The other thing is, there almost 50 million of them are going to be eligible to vote. Now, this is eligible to vote. But 50 million is a huge number of folks in the American electorate. This is for this election. Ultimately, every year, 3.6 million of these become more eligible to vote. So, you know, you might have the 65-year-old woman kind of category, but they're not getting any more of those, right, in the country. Whereas if you got basically the youth vote, you're basically getting 3.6 new folks every year for another decade here. So ultimately, there'll be 75 million of them eligible to vote by 2016. This is a hugely disruptive force in politics. It is hugely disruptive of what this could actually do. Now, one of the things, just going to move fast here, one of the things about them that also is different is they are diverse. They're the most diverse generation yet in America. And this is actually a big deal, too, because it actually colors their politics and it colors their kind of value set here. And here's just the big one, of course, is Hispanics. Because in that 80s and 90s when we were talking about the boomers starting to have their kids, there was also huge levels, historically huge levels of immigration, particularly from Latin America. And so what you've had here is very much, it rivaled the rates basically that we saw in the beginning of the 20th century from Europe. This is a huge thing. Now, how this plays out over the century then is by 2000, we already had 34 million Hispanics in the country. By 2050, basically we're going to have over 100 million of folks of Hispanic descent. This is essentially a quarter of the population by 2050. It's a huge impact. And this generation, all these folks from the inflow here, are essentially the young people coming into play right now. This shows you the different generations, how diverse they are. This is from the oldest, the GI, through the boomers here. This is the diversity as a percentage. And so what you've got here with the millennials are almost 40% of millennials are from minority groups, and pushing now towards majority eventually here, what we'll probably get for the next generation. Very interesting, and again, how that plays in your politics makes a big difference, and how it plays in their values we'll see soon. Now, this is where we kind of starting point. This kind of how big, who they are, basically the basic demographics of them. Now we're going to talk, and this is where Rui comes up here. Rui and I, but particularly Rui, did a lot of work on trying to look at these numbers. And what we wanted to do is essentially kind of challenge some of the myths that people have, but also kind of give as accurate a picture as we can of these young folks. Now, one thing that comes on is people say, well, young people don't vote. In politics, you hear this all the time. Well, they don't vote. You don't have to worry about them. That is not true. These folks are voting in higher numbers than previous young people. The other thing to remember about this is all young people aren't the same. Basically, there is a life cycle thing that happens with generations, but basically every generation has a different personality and often acts very differently. And when it comes to political engagement, that's true of this generation. And so here's what we got. We've got some numbers. So Rui, give us some ideas of some of the data we're starting to see here.
Okay, well, this is just data
Wait, are
from the...
you turned on?
I thought it was.
Oop. Can you hear?
I think I'm turned on.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, okay. Turn on to it. That's from another generation. Okay, this is data about 18 to 24-year-olds who were all millennials in 2004, but not in 2000. It just shows that their turnout went up 11 points from the 2000 to 2004 election. This was a much larger turnout increase than for any other age group.
And that's the other thing is we're also comparing it always to different age groups. So as he said, that was the highest turnout.
Turnout increase.
The highest turnout increase. Are you sure you're? I don't know if you are turned down here. Can you hear me better than him?
Yes.
Oh.
Well,
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
He's not turned on. Yeah, the video guys are saying you're not turned on. Hang on a second.
Move this up. Isn't it supposed? Hello?
There we
Hello?
go. Can you hear it there?
Did you hear any difference?
Okay. Why don't you talk over here?
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Well, now that we all can presumably hear each other, okay, this just shows they're more politically engaged than sort of the late Gen Xers. You compare 18 to 29-year-olds between 1999 and 2007. This is just interest in local politics, up 28 points. Interest in national affairs, up 14 points over this time period. So not only are they voting more, but they seem more interested in following politics and in national affairs. Okay, and this is some interesting data from a series of good surveys that are done by the Harvard Institute of Politics of 18 to 24-year-olds. They've been doing these for a while. And this one is from 2006, pretty recently. And this just shows that they asked them a series of questions about that kind of tap different elements of political cynicism. And sort of across the board here, millennials were rejecting these propositions. Politics isn't relevant to my life. Who the president is doesn't matter. They disagreed with that. This actually is people like me, I think, have no say in government. It wasn't specifically about millennials. Political involvement has no tangible results. Difficult to find ways to be politically involved. So across the board, they're kind of rejecting these cliches of political cynicism that seem so common in our society.
And one of the things, too, is the generation before them, actually Generation X, was very quite cynical about politics. So this is not only just bigger than most youth people, it's actually much bigger than the Gen X was. This shifts it a little bit to civic-minded as opposed to politically engaged, but it's interesting.
Right. So this is taken from the American Freshman Survey, which is done of college freshmen. It's done every year, and it's got like 700,000 respondents. So this is an immense survey and a kind of a gold standard for some of this kind of stuff. And this shows that in the 2006 survey, I think the data actually collected in late 2005. But anyway, this was the highest it's been in 40 years, in fact, in the entire history of this particular survey. 83% said in their senior year in high school they volunteered occasionally, and 71% said they volunteered weekly. So that's a pretty impressive level of engagement.
And again, this would not just be those trying to get into college, right? I mean, this.
No, these are in college. These are college.
Oh, these are in college. Okay,
These are
so
college
good.
freshmen.
So some people say, well, you know, they all got to do this to get in college, which might be some of it, but also it shows unusually high levels of going. Now, there's one thing about political engagement. So you say, okay, that's good. More people involved, get them more and more involved. What's happening? But what's happening here is very clear. They've been voting Democratic. And again, this is not that all young people tend to do that. Generation X, the generation right before them, voted high numbers for Republicans. So it isn't just a young person thing. This is a millennial thing. And this is starting to be very, very clear how they've actually voting. And we're going to run through the numbers just briefly here. But they haven't been out enough to really lock in. But there is a rule of thumb in political generational kind of analysis that once you vote for one party or one ideological movement or one party or the other, for 3 times in a row, you tend to actually lock into that and stay with them for the rest of your life. And so this is something that we've got 2 of them down here to see, and we'll see where we go for the 3rd one here, which is this one, the 2008 election.
Okay, well, this is actually some party identification data. Which party do you identify with or lean toward? These are some few data that have been collected over time. This shows how Generation X felt about the political parties in 1991. And as you can see, it was a massive Republican advantage of 55% Republican to 33% Democratic. Pretty remarkable leanings toward the Republicans among Gen X, and they actually have continued to lean Republican and by and large vote Republican since then. Now this is the millennials, a different story. This is data collected from 2006, and this shows that among 18 to 25-year-olds, we got a 14-point advantage for the Democrats among party ID. Pretty much the reverse image of what we had.
Just back and forth, boop, boop.
Right, we have them actually side by side, do we not,
Yeah.
Maestro?
Yeah, we'll do, oops, wait a second, yeah. Let's see, go, oops, there we go.
There we go. So this shows the 2 side by side, so we don't get whiplash going back and forth between them. And I mean, one thing that is really remarkable is the difference between the Republican Party ID among 18 to 25-year-olds in 91 versus 06. Look at that, a 20-point crash for the Republican Party. You can read, I mean, arguably, this could be one of the most, if not the most salient fact about U.S. politics today, that the Republicans are losing an entire generation. Okay, this shows how young people voted in 2004, essentially. This is basically assigning states on the basis of how 18 to 29-year-olds voted in that particular state. And as you can see, it would have been an overwhelming Kerry victory. Alas, it didn't happen, but maybe in the future. Anyway, I believe the actual vote was 54-45 among 18 to 29-year-olds. But it's interesting to compare the 18 to 24-year-olds to the 25 to 29-year-olds. The 18 to 24-year-olds in 2004 were part of this generation, millennial generation, and they voted 56-43 Democratic. If you look at the 25 to 29-year-olds, they voted only 51-48 Democratic. So already you can see emerging this heavy Democratic bias among the millennial generation.
So the older folks in this generation, just to be clear, were Gen X, essentially the tail end of Gen X, as opposed to, but they were still young people in 2004.
Okay, now this is this is one of our favorite facts. 60 to 38 advantage of the congressional vote for Democrats, 18 to 29-year-olds in this most recent election. This is just a huge margin. This is the greatest advantage Democrats have ever had among young people insofar as we can go back and look at the exit polls. So quite a remarkable performance. No real difference either between the among 18 to 24-year-olds. There was a 21-point margin among that age group. Again, all these, pretty much except for 1 year, these were all millennials, and it is a remarkable fact. And as Pete says, we'll see how this locks in over time. But again, if you were a Republican, you were worrying about where your party was going, this is one fact you'd look at and be extremely depressed about, I would think.
Now, this guy isn't a millennial, but and he actually comes across trying to be more the right-wing conservative thing. But because it's all tongue-in-cheek, this is a great millennial idol, and we use it as a good example here because it's not just that they're voting Democratic, because there's a large Big Tent in the Democratic Party, but they're actually voting Democratic in the kind of core progressive values that you'd be thinking about. And so it really is actually pushing it even another notch further than just deciding to vote Democratic. It's actually the progressive version of this, which is quite interesting. Now, as we kind of walk through this, we'll start to just knock off some kind of things that people, normally think of, associate with a more progressive version of this. And again, we're thinking of it not in terms of factional battles between, the different factions of Democrats in the last couple decades or something, but we're thinking of a more historical kind of sense of what are the core values of the progressive movement of the Democratic Party long term. And one of them, of course, is the environment. And these kids, or these young people, I should say, because they're in their 20s now, overwhelmingly are basically supportive of the environment and a lot of things that it'll take to actually turn things around. So here's some examples.
Yeah, this is basically whether you would put a priority on protecting the environment over economic growth, and in fact even at the expense of economic growth if necessary. Among 18 to 29-year-olds in this poll, it was 58% saying yes, but among those 65 and over, pretty different, 44% saying yes.
And with global warming on the horizon here, this is a thing we're going to need to start doing. So it'll be, well, maybe not necessarily for economic growth, but these are some trade-offs that are going to get serious in politics soon here. Now, there's a couple other ways to do this, not with charts, but these are from another survey. You want to talk about this here?
Well, these are all from the Pew Gen Next study, which I actually recommend to all of you. A wonderful study that came out in early 2007, which collects a lot of data, mostly from Pew surveys about 18 to 25-year-olds. So anyway, one part of it dealt with the environment, and they pointed out that millennials overwhelmingly believe that the country should do whatever it takes to protect the environment. Why don't you just show the other two here? That stricter environmental laws and regulations worth the cost, and the people should be willing to pay higher prices in order to protect the environment. These were, very heavy majorities in favor of all three of them. How heavy, I don't know because they didn't put the data in the report, but judging from the general population figures, I'd say these were in the 70 to 85% range among 18 to 25-year-olds, so very close to consensual among this age group.
Oops, sorry. Now we're moving to tolerance, which is, you can think of this generally, and it has to do with a lot of diverse issues. This generation is very amazing how they don't really see racial differences, sexual differences, and for that matter, sexual orientation differences in any way the same that the rest of the country does.
Okay, I think this is really a remarkable piece of data here. I mean, not too long ago, 20 years ago, 18 to 25-year-olds, basically Gen Xers, these are among whites, were asked, is it all right for blacks and whites to date each other? And, you got a majority saying yes, 56%, but, that's not hardly overwhelming. Kind of remarkable when you think about it. But, flash forward to 2003 when 18 to 25-year-olds are millennials, and you get 89% saying yes. I mean, basically overwhelming, no doubt about it. Their minds are made up. In fact, I think on this question, 64% completely agreed with this proposition, which is pretty remarkable. So that's quite a change. And this is some stuff about immigration. You consistently find this in poll after poll. That, there is obviously a big controversy about immigration in this country, but the people who feel most positively about immigrants and the contribution they're making to American society and are least worried about them tend to be young people. So this was a Pew study from a couple of years ago, and they asked 18 to 25, in the 18 to 25-year-old subsample, you find basically, well over 2 to 1, 67 to 30, saying immigrants strengthen America rather than a threat to our values and a drain in our society. So that's pretty impressive. And of course, gay marriage is one of the things, and gay rights in general, attitudes to gay people, is one of the things on which millennials, the younger generation, differs most radically from other generations. So you've got 56% in this Pew survey saying they're in favor of legalizing gay marriage, which is still a minority position in this country, and you can see that from looking at all adults, where it's only 37% in this survey. So, they're just way above the rest of the population in terms of their acceptance of gay people, their belief that gay marriage is perfectly fine, really. There's another question where, again, most people are not happy about the gay adopting children by gay people, but, well over 60% of millennials say that that's perfectly fine.
Okay, sorry, I thought there was another study. Multilateralism, this is another interesting thing. Given that the attitudes to war, this is not necessarily just what to do about Iraq, but we were trying to actually get a sense of how they actually think America should act in the world, and there's some interesting pieces of how they think about this.
Okay, so this is a survey taken in 04, 1829. This shows that basically they were asked, upon what does America's security depend? And 57% says basically it's cooperating with other countries and using diplomacy. Only 37% said it really relies on military strength. This split, this difference even goes back to just after 9/11, when a similar question was asked about, I think, what's the best way to ensure peace in the world, and you got a split among millennials about whether you should rely on military strength to do this or not, but the rest of the population was 60, 70% saying the way to do it is with military force. And remember, this was right after 9/11 when that sort of thinking was much more common than it is today. Okay, this is another example of the same kind of dynamic. This is asking people, several years ago, what happens when you rely on military force in the world? Does it defeat terrorism, or does it wind up creating more hatred and more terrorism? And as you can see, there's a narrow split in favor of the idea it creates more hatred and terrorism among those older than 25. But among the 18 to 25-year-old millennials, they're pretty clear what the dynamic is here and what the trade-off here. 67% think moving and sort of approaching the world in that way just creates more hatred and terrorism. And here's
this is just the same thing.
Comparison.
Big shift, though. Really interesting. Inequality, another bread and butter thing here. This has been coming up anecdotally, very disturbed by the income inequalities that they've been watching as they come of age here, and the data shows us again, this is something that really deeply concerns them. Let's see this.
Okay, this is from the 2004 National Election Study, the premier political science academic survey. 84% of millennials said the rich-poor gap has increased over the last decade or two, and 94% said that increase in the rich-poor gap was bad. This is higher than among any other generation in the survey.
And these inequality, there's again a couple ways to think about this. We just kind of pulled these out from other studies. You want to just, without...
Yeah, this is from the 2006 exit polls. Just shows that 18 to 29-year-old voters, more than any other age group, did support raising the minimum wage, whereas referenda, around 3/4 were in favor. And this is something from an NPI study that was done, we presented last year. Basically, the the sort of early millennials there, those 18 to 22 at the time of this survey, were more likely than another age group to say the government should take action to reduce the economic differences among Americans.
And then the final thing here, which we're going to just round out on in terms of this values thing, is their belief in government. Now, this is, the Republicans and conservatives have been kind of denigrating the role of government in the country's public life for the last 20 years. But it's amazing is how these young folks have maintained this very strong belief in the effectiveness of government.
Now, obviously, over the past several decades, there's been kind of an anti-government strain in American politics. People tend to think, many, that the government, when it tries to solve things, just kind of screws things up even more. But it looks like today's young people beg to disagree. This was from the Circle, a 15 to 25-year-old survey, and you got, over 2 to 1 saying government should do more to solve problems, rather than the government's already doing too much and essentially screwing things up. This is some Democracy Corps data. It shows views among 30 to 39-year-olds, so right above the millennials, Gen Xers basically. Is the government's role to promote a strong community and policies to promote general prosperity, or is it the heck with that, just get out of the way, promote self-reliance, and have low taxes? So looking at the 30 to 39-year-old Gen Xers, you have a very close 50 to 45 split, but a little different among our primarily millennial 18 to 29-year-old group, 63-35, so 28-point margin in favor of let's strengthen communities, let's have policies to promote prosperity for everybody. And there's that side-by-side split, again, quite a contrast with just the immediate generation ahead of them. So this is another interesting kind of comparison between, nice to do these comparisons, take the Gen Xers at the age millennials are now and see how they felt, and it's pretty different. I mean, when they asked millennials, Gen Xers in 87, 88, do you think if government does something, it's necessarily inefficient and wasteful? Classic Reaganite kind of formulation. They were split right down the middle, couldn't quite make up their minds. But if we look at where millennials are today, 18 to 25-year-olds in 03, exactly 2 to 1, 64-32, disagreeing, saying it's not true, it's not the case that a government does something that's necessarily inefficient and wasteful.
And that's, again,
our side-by-side here. So
by the way, all this stuff, all these data is going to be in this report, so if I see people kind of scribbling down, certainly take notes, but we also have a lot of this laid out. Not the exact PowerPoint, but the report. Now we're just going to, as we wind out here a little bit on this data here, or on this report, on this talk, there's a thing that people think about. This is like from my Wired magazine days, but it was interesting because every generation tends to have a personality. It comes about from what shapes them when they come of age, or the different forces at work, different kind of things that actually kind of craft who they are essentially at their early stage. And so what you really got to get at is like, what is the personality almost of a generation? Because what that is tends to animate how they're going to act for the rest of their lives. And with the millennial personality, one thing that is very clear, very interesting about this is they are extremely optimistic. And so that's why we put that image up there. And so here's an example.
Right. Well, so the millennials may be optimistic, as we're saying, but that doesn't necessarily apply to the people older than them. You ask people, will children be better off in the future than they are now? You got pretty strong disagreement, 22-point margin in favor they'll be worse off. 18 to 29-year-olds, quite different by a 5-point margin. They actually think kids will be better off in the future, and there's a variety of indicators that show this true. I mean, will you personally be doing better in 5 years? Will sort of the economy be better in 10 years? There's just a whole range of indicators that show that when you ask these questions about where's the country going, what's the next generation going to have economically, what's your future economic trajectory, typically the millennials are the most optimistic generation, despite the fact they recognize there are a lot of problems with the way the economy is working today. They know there are problems with retirement security, health security, and so on, but fundamentally they think we can get it done, that we can make things better, and that they're going to have a better life in the future. Now, this is, as people may be aware, there have been some problems with youth in the past, and there still are some today with people using drugs, teenage pregnancy, a variety of other things. One thing that's kind of under-publicized is that this stuff is dropping, and it's dropping particularly among this generation. So this is from the Monitoring the Future survey that the National Institute of Drug Abuse does for about 50,000 people a year, so very gold standard kind of survey. And so we see a decline from 1996, when the millennials were first starting to get into their senior year, here, 42% down to 37% among, how many say they have used drugs in the last year.
Sorry.
And down from 24 to 15 among 8th graders who say they've used drugs. And there's a variety of other indicators. The teen pregnancy rate is down about, I believe, 36% since 1990, down about 31% for teen births. Violent crime, we're now running about 15, violent juvenile crime, we're now running about 15% below its long-term average, but it's 40% over its long-term average in 1994. Millennials were first starting to come online. So again, I mean, good kids, well, yeah, probably by and large, certainly gooder than they were in the recent past.
And then we're going to wind out here. This is something that everyone kind of takes for granted, but this pulls the whole thing together, because really what's happening is they are absolutely come of age in this new technology. And so if just, without going through all the numbers, we thought we'd throw a couple out and then just kind of wind out here. For example, here's an example of just in the last day. Go ahead, just if you want to do this one.
Well, in the last day, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of data like this, a cornucopia, actually. This just shows in the last day how many people have used these particular aspects of technology. So email, obviously, almost everybody. Read news online. Use MySpace, Facebook, 41% just in the last day. 40% say they have IM. These are higher than other generations. The one that stands out the most, though, we'll see in a second, which is use of mobile media, text message. So this was from the Pew survey. 51% in the last 24 hours among 18 to 25-year-olds say they sent or received a text message. So, and then it drops off to 26% among the next age group, 10% among 40 to 60, basically, and over 60, only 4%. So just a massive, drop off there.
And then this one is another one. This is just in the Times just yesterday or earlier this week, so we grabbed this thing. It's very, very interesting. It's like it asks which generations, different generations, what technology could they not do without me. And look at how millennials value their computer first. 40% said, no way I could do it without that. Second is cell phone, then television. Look how television goes up as you go across to older and older generations. And look at how this goes down. So it's a really, really telling example. And so where's politics played? Politics run by boomers basically now. It's all played in television still. And why? Because they don't do this down here. Very interesting shift that we got. It's an interesting thing to go. Now again, this is well known, understood. These are the young people. But what's not understood is clearly, it starts to merge in with what we do at the New Politics Institute. And so just to kind of wind out here. These are the kids that essentially are doing this new media. There's young people. Web video, mobile media, online games, social networking. We do a lot of this at the New Politics Institute. I'm not going to go into a lot of it. Just to throw out, though, for those who are not young people out there, just to kind of remind folks of like the scale of what's happening. Why do we get here? YouTube has got 100 million video streams a day going off it right now. 100 million a day. Well, that's because you've got all these millennials kind of going for that. Now, that's a sign of where this is going in the future. The other thing is mobile media. Millennials use 70% more minutes than the average minutes of all age groups combined. They are just on the phones all the time. Basically, 800,000, almost 1 million joined and these are mostly young people, joined Bono on anti-poverty campaign by text message. I mean, this is a way you connect to these folks, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second here. The third thing is, online gaming and stuff, although this isn't particularly just a young person phenomenon. This is Second Life. Look at the numbers. It's going through the roofs. A lot of the people are kind of come of age, understanding video games, online games. This is another medium to actually connect with those folks, for those in politics. And then ultimately here, the social networking is a huge, huge youth thing. And this is in fact, what we've got here is one of our speakers here is going to be introduced in a minute here, was actually the young person that actually started this million for Barack Obama. And within the space of 1 month, they got 250,000 folks, and it's continued to go up, and he'll talk a little bit about that. But these 4 technologies, absolutely ways to connect to these folks. And so to kind of just wind it up here is to kind of say this. Why does this really matter? I mean, it matters just from the sheer numbers. It matters it's affecting politics. It matters a lot if you're a progressive or a Democrat. My God, this is a good thing. But on a deeper level for the sense of the country, why does this matter? And one of the things that matters is that the last time the country went through a huge and profound, essentially, era of innovation and essentially what we call now a progressive era was back with FDR and in the 30s and 40s, and actually how it reshaped the world in the 20th century to actually create the world of the late 20th century and the world that we've still kind of inherited today. And one of the interesting things about that, a lot of things came together in this, and Simon introduced us here. Simon and I have a different way of explaining all the pieces that come together to kind of open up the opportunity for progressives. But the piece here about the generational thing is very clear. Young people were nuts for this guy. They voted in extremely high numbers for FDR. And this was the young generation called the GI generation, what came to be known as the GI generation. This was the earliest Gallup polls were started in the 30s. They could actually track this, and they realized that, oh my God, young people were nuts about this guy. What happened was these folks voted consistently for them in the 30s, and then they locked into the Democratic Party, and they voted progressive for the entire lifetime. Now they're in their 80s and 90s, and they're still pulling the lever for the Democrats as they're kind of, barely getting to the polls. But basically, this is an incredible, it was a huge generation, very powerful generation. It was this GI generation. The thing about this, and one of the people that has done this, is that this GI generation has a lot of similar characteristics to the millennial generation. And the guy who really has done a ton on this is Bill Strauss. William Strauss is a generational theorist. We've had him speak here a year ago for MPI. He's really kind of laid this out most clearly than anybody, so I'm kind of borrowing from him here. But there's a lot of things about these generations that are very similar. They were very civic-minded. They were very kind of collaborative. They were team builders. They weren't individualists. They were very kind of concerned about inequality and looking out for everybody. They were willing to sacrifice. In fact, what they did in the GI generation, saved the world for democracy, World War II, came back and built the post-war boom. They basically built all the school systems and stuff for their kids, the boomers. This was a selfless generation, one that has now been kind of lionized as the greatest generation. That was Brokaw's book of the greatest generation, and for good reason. But what we're kind of positing here is a lot of the same pieces are coming together with this millennial generation, and there is the potential here, and we got to see if it'll literally pay out for this millennial generation to be, in fact, the greatest generation, because that greatest generation of the GIs is as of yet, and we actually have the potential here, and the challenges ahead of us in this country, as well as the need to actually have a really engaged new generation that can actually remake American society and the economy, and that's what we might have here. So the final end here is if we are going to see a kind of beginning of a new progressive era, and again, it's ours to see here if it's going to play out in the next 10, 20 years here, one of the key components most certainly will be this millennial generation. So that's the end of the presentation for this thing, and you can find the report here at the New Politics Institute. You can get the thing. We're going to actually hand it out here as you go out today. And so what we're going to do now quickly is we're going to turn to two other speakers, and then we're going to open it up for a little discussion.